You walk into the DMV to renew your license or to register your car or whatever it is, and there's someone there who's wearing short sleeves and they've got a lanyard and they look at you with a dead face and they say, oh, you brought in 3 proofs of your residence, but you actually did 4 and you have to go home, and you're just enraged. That is the impression that many Americans have of government writ large. The impression they have is that this is not an institution that is working for them. We as Democrats, as progressives, I think need to acknowledge that frustration. Like, we need to be honest.
Hello, I'm Congressman Ritchie Torres with the next move from the Renewed Democracy Initiative, and I'm proud to be joined by one of the leading thought leaders in modern politics, Marc Dunkelman, who wrote a wonderful book, Why Nothing Works.
Thrilled to be here.
It feels like there's an intellectual movement taking hold in the left of American politics. There's the book Stuck, written by Yoni Applebaum, which writes about the lack of mobility in America. There's Abundance by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein, writing about the lack of abundance. And then we have your book, which is writing about the lack of progress. And it feels like of the 3 books, yours is the most direct critique of progressivism. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I think that my book is an attempt to help progressives understand the roots of their own ideological movement. That there's a sense that American democracy is stuck, that our movement is stuck, that we're not doing the things that we need to do. We're frustrated ourselves, and we can't exactly understand what's happened to us. And I'm trying to provide a framework so that people can understand this is not something about Trump stopping us or the Republicans stopping us or conservatives stopping us. This is something that we've done to ourselves because we don't understand our own ideology. And so I think in the way, those are terrific books, both Stuck and Abundance. I'm trying to provide some historical perspective so that people will understand how we got to this moment and why we're frustrated now.
Now, your book emphasizes the debate between Jeffersonianism and Hamiltonianism, which is as old as America itself. But you're the first thinker to locate that debate within progressivism.
So when progressivism was born at the turn of the 20th century, the problem was, again, then, that nothing worked. That we wanted to be able to build sewer systems and modern transit systems and modern housing, and power was too diffused across the country, which left a power vacuum that was filled by these trusts and these sort of powerful robber barons. And there was a debate among these reformers, most of whom embraced some element of both ideas, and they both have appeal. That the first idea, which is to push power down, walk through antitrust, was, I call, a Jeffersonian idea, in the sense that Jefferson believed in yeoman farmers. He was frightened of centralized authority and wanted continually to disperse it, to distribute it, so that no one would get the better of someone else. Hamilton, at the same time, at the beginning of the Republic, and then among these progressives later, more than a century later, their idea was, look, we've got these huge companies. We should create big bureaucracies that can take them on, or that can build the sewer system, because obviously that's not something that...
Or electrify rural America.
Electrify rural America, electrify at that point, electrify urban America, right? So could we build dams? Could we build eventually highways? Could we build a space program? That's these big bureaucracies that are centralized with powerful fingers. That's a progressive idea in the Hamiltonian sense. There's no purely Hamiltonian progressive or purely Jeffersonian progressive. And the question is, do we understand how they play against each other? Can we put them to effective use? And really, can we balance them in a way that makes it almost sure that America will progress?
Now, in the 1970s, we saw a paradigm shift from Hamiltonian progressivism, which gave us an electrified rural America, to a Jeffersonian progressivism. The theory of Jeffersonian progressivism is that it's putting power where it belongs, in the hands of the people.
Yes.
But you argue the reality is actually more complicated.
Yeah. So both of these paradigms, I think that's a good word for it. The Hamiltonian ethos had prevailed from the beginning of the movement through the 1960s, 70s. And the idea there was to push power into these big, powerful institutions. The classic is the Tennessee Valley Authority, but there were lots of others. The Federal Highway Administration, big housing projects were built with...
Public housing here in New York.
Exactly. NYCHA is certainly a Hamiltonian institution. So like that system had prevailed, and like it was this alphabet soup of programs: Social Security, the Public Works Administration, and the New Deal. And it was then the military, which is obviously a Hamiltonian institution. They had gotten us through the Great Depression and the war. And then in the 60s and 70s, for a whole variety of reasons, there's generational change. But there's also evidence the establishment is not doing a good job, right? The establishment has gotten us into the Vietnam War. The establishment,
The best and the brightest.
the best and the brightest, is
Robert McNamara, Robert Moses.
Robert Moses is here in New York. Robert Moses is revealed to be this character who had been sort of benighted, like he had been seen as apolitical and doing the right thing and working in the public interest. And then in 1974, Robert Caro writes this book, The Power Broker, that reveals that in fact he's doing things that are not in the public interest at all. And so in that moment, progressivism, and certainly the boomers, look at the old establishment and turn against it. And they say to themselves, really the problem here is not that these institutions don't have insufficient power, it's that they are too powerful. And our impulse is going to be to push power back down so that ordinary people can protect themselves.
Are you touching on an eternal contradiction within Jeffersonian progressivism? Because typically we think of conservative as suspicious of government.
Yeah.
And progressives and liberals as professing a faith in government. But you're telling me that Jeffersonian progressives both have a faith in government, but are also deeply suspicious of it.
Well, I think you and me, and almost everyone else who calls themselves a progressive, have both of these impulses in their hearts and minds. We both want to build up governments so that it can do great things, and we are very nervous about powerful figures who would exercise the power required to do great things. And so the switch that you're referring to in the 1960s is that we were prevailingly Hamiltonian. The movement was prevailingly Hamiltonian from, say, the 1880s through the 1960s. By the 1970s, it is an overwhelmingly Jeffersonian. We are going to try to figure out who holds power, and we're going to try to check that power so that it doesn't build a highway through a vibrant urban neighborhood, so that it doesn't approve a car that's unsafe at any speed, so that it doesn't get us into a foreign endeavor that is a sure loser and oppressive and violent. And so for 50 years, in almost every realm, our first impulse when looking at a problem is who is powerful in the situation and how do we strip that institution of power.
I represent the Bronx here, which is the poorest congressional district in America. There's a quote often attributed to William Faulkner. The past is not dead, it's not even past.
Yes.
And I feel like nowhere are those words more true than the South Bronx, which is haunted by the ghost of Robert Moses.
Yeah.
Whose legacy includes the Cross Bronx Expressway, which has left behind decades of disinvestment and displacement and environmental degradation in the Bronx.
Yep.
Arson and abandonment in the 1970s. I mean, how does your critique of the shift toward Jeffersonian progressivism, grapple with the legacy of Robert Moses? Because that was a genuine problem.
The impulse, having seen what Robert Moses did, was then to say, all right, Robert Moses held these various hats, among them effectively the chairman of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority today. Like at the time, it was called the Proper Appropriation General Authority. He held other hats as well. But he held this power, and it was unchecked. And the essence of the progressive agenda since that era has been to say power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we as progressives are going to put new restrictions around authority of all types. The point here is not that Robert Moses was good or that Robert Moses was bad. The point here is not that every restriction is bad or every restriction is good. It is what balance do we want to have so that someone is empowered when there is clearly a crisis of public confidence in the government to be able to deliver. What is the proper amount of restriction so that we can both have things get done and make sure that they are not done in such an abusive way as we saw happen in the 1950s?
I feel like when there is criticism of government, it provokes a discomfort among those of us who are liberal or progressive because we have a basic belief in the nobility of government, in the efficacy of government. How do you critique government without delegitimizing it, especially at a time we were witnessing a decimation of the federal workforce at the hands of Doge, at the hands of Donald Trump and Elon Musk?
But the first thing is, people have an impression of government irrespective of what we say about it. So if we're not going to identify with their frustrations, like you've already lost the conversation, right? To the degree that we've all had the experience, and maybe this doesn't happen anymore at New York's DMV, but it certainly happens at other DMVs, that you're walking to the DMV to renew your license or to register your car or whatever it is, and there's someone there who's wearing short sleeves and they've got a lanyard and they look at you with a dead face and they say, oh, you brought in 3 proofs of your residence, but you actually did 4 and you have to go home, and you're just enraged. That is the impression that many Americans have of government writ large. So they have the impression they have is that this is not an institution that is working for them. It's an institution that is inhibiting them from succeeding. We as Democrats, as progressives, I think need to acknowledge that frustration. Like, we need to be on the side of people who want government to work. Once they believe that we are fighting for them rather than just defending the bureaucracy in and of itself, then we can have a discussion about how we want it to grow, expand, become more efficacious. Then we can begin to talk about the possibilities of what government can do more than it is doing now. But at a moment when it seems like government just is fundamentally broken, we need to be the ones saying, we believe in government, we believe it is broken, we are going to fix it, and then we will make it do the things that you want it to do.
So America was once a nation of builders,
Yeah.
and we'd become a nation of bureaucrats. And one of the textbook illustrations of American bureaucracy is NEPA, as the National Environmental Policy Act. To what extent do you see NEPA as part of the problem? Because in the early 20th century, we built the Empire State Building in a year. Today, the environmental review for the Empire State Building would be longer than the actual construction. So,
Yeah.
So what should we do about NEPA?
First of all, we should recognize what NEPA was. NEPA was passed by a Democratic Congress, signed by President Richard Nixon, January 1st, 1970, because government at the time was building things without even considering the environmental impacts. There was an effort at that time, there was a Hamiltonian effort to push power up into the Environmental Protection Agency, to give regulators more power to control emissions. We stopped the spate of acid rain a few decades later. Like ozone layer, those are things that we don't talk about anymore. Staggering achievements, and those were efforts to push power up into the hands of regulators who could really force polluters to stop polluting. NEPA was a Jeffersonian reform. It was a reform designed to push power down to the ordinary citizen who's afraid that a new highway or a new project or a new power plant or whatever it is going to impact their lives. It was an effort to make it so that if you didn't have a champion who was in a big bureaucracy, you could still have some power. That is a fundamentally progressive notion. In most realms, even today, when you go, I think, among your peers on the Hill, the impulse is almost immediately, certainly in certain corners of our movement, is to say, who has power here? How am I going to disperse it? How am I going to distribute it more so that ordinary people have a greater say? And absolutely, people should not be held silent. Absolutely, those who make decisions should have to hear what the public's response is. But if you make it so that it's such a cacophony that almost anybody has essentially a veto over any big public project, you're not going to get anything done.
But it feels like among progressives, there's agreement on the goals.
Yes.
We need more clean energy. We need more affordable housing. But there's disagreements about the means by which to achieve those goals. And the status quo is fundamentally failing the very working people who we claim to champion. Here in New York City, in the span of a decade, 20% of the young black population has disappeared. In the early 20th century, we saw African Americans migrating from the South to the North in order to escape Jim Crow. And now we're seeing a reverse migration in order to escape the affordability crisis in blue states and blue cities like New York. And so that's the fundamental problem that your book aims to solve. What does an abundance or a Hamiltonian progressive agenda look like?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that as someone who's been in politics, my sense of the marketing of this thing is that we've got a long way to go.
Yeah.
Permitting reform is perhaps the most boring phrase I've ever I fall asleep almost mid sentence. They started with supply side progressivism. I have no idea what that is.
Yeah.
I hate state capacity. It sounds like we're
Yeah.
just hiring more bureaucrats. In the end, my view is that there is ordinary people are making decisions in their own lives all the time. Are we going to go to Olive Garden? Are we going to go to McDonald's? Right? Like one's going to cost more but better food. One's going to be right. Like people are making these judgments all the time, and within their families, they're having to negotiate between different people who have different priorities. And that we need to be articulating in an abundance agenda that's what government needs to do. We need to be able to look at different options and have someone in the end pick between them.
Because I can easily imagine, without, and this is not your burden, but it's going to become fashionable. It is becoming fashionable to say, "Oh, I'm a pro-abundance Democrat," right?
Yes.
Everyone's going to call themselves a pro-abundance Democrat. I have a colleague who is advocating for rent control under the guise of abundance. So.
Right. I'd like people to be saying, who should decide? Who, in the end, decides whether we do it or not? Right? At a certain point in our past, it would have been the head of the Port Authority or the head of the MTA.
Right.
Right? Now, is it the governor? Like it came from Bloomberg. Like at that point, it was a mayoral thing. Is it Jana Lieber? Is it some combination of Phil Murphy and the governor of New York? Is it President Trump who's going to withdraw funding to kill the thing? Is it if Josh Gottheimer's lawsuit comes? Is it going to be the judge that decides that? Like, who is it that? Like, I think we should be saying, like, we need someone who can decide things.
But I take your book to mean that these important policy questions are not being decided by the duly elected officials, but by well-lawyered, well-lobbied.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think they like. I think they're fundamentally not being decided, right? It's not.
Well, the decision to kill it or prevent it from.
If everyone has the decision to kill it, there is no one who is fundamentally deciding. There is a proper division of labor between the branches. The problem is now if all three branches. If it's like the Public Authorities Control Board and the governor and the heads of both state legislative chambers have a veto over everything, and it just becomes a game of who's going to say no to what. It just becomes insider deal making. That's not work to anyone's benefit.
Well, thank you for joining us at The Next Move and sharing your vision for renewing democracy.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Good to see you.